This is Paul Nobles from eatperform.com. I am sitting here with Catherine Adams. She's a little thumbnail in the bottom right there, but Catherine, if you want to say hi to everyone.
Hi, everyone.
So Catherine is actually a rock star in the Eat to Perform world, but she's also very popular on the internet. Her pictures, her back picture and her front picture are the pictures that we use in ads quite a bit. And people seem to resonate with those pictures, right, Catherine? I mean, it's kind of interesting. I have to say, though, like I did kind of want to talk about it a little bit. I was a little bit more frustrated, not so much with your picture, but you know, the picture that we used of Chris the other day. With your picture, though, someone said, you know, kind of in a negative way, and I'm sure you've seen some negative comments towards, you know, your picture in the past. And I just, you know, one, it really makes me mad, you know, that people judge other people's physique. You know, I mean, like if you don't want to have visible abs, you know, maybe that, you know, as a female, that's your right, but you know, you don't really need to kind of throw that out there into the ether. But what I think is sort of interesting about it, you know, because we were talking, you know, when I posted the picture of Chris, I didn't really think twice of it. I was really just kind of looking for a picture that we had. And because I did the show with Chris, I was like, oh, well, here's a good picture of Chris. I'm going to put it out there. Well, what was funny about the picture, you know, that we know that probably the good majority of people didn't see, is that Chris has kitten tights on. And that's why it's sort of a funny picture in general. And so a bunch of people, you know, made comments about him not having abs popping out, right? And I think that is, you know, one of the most frustrating things for me is the discussion about abs, because you know, if Chris did more than a couple, you know, minutes of crunches before he took that picture, you know, his abs certainly would have been popping out. And I think that's a little bit of the expectation that as viewers, like, we need to be looking out for, because you know, a lot of the images that are being put out there, you know, they're not real images, not the same way that yours is or that Chris, but what was interesting about it was, right as I was reading the criticisms and banned and delete a bunch of people, you know, it's kind of funny. Do you know who Dikembe Mutombo is? Does that name ring a bell to you?
No.
So Dikembe Mutombo is a basketball Hall of Famer, and he was known for shot blocks.
Yeah.
And, you know, I've sort of joked in the past that I have more blocks than Dikembe Mutombo, because, you know, in general, I don't tolerate a lot of negativity. And you know, my initial instinct was sort of use this space to kind of talk about, you know, even almost to the point of calling these people out, like, hey, John from Poughkeepsie, New York, you know. And then someone messaged me, and it was one of our members, and, you know, she's 65 years old. And she said, you know, I just want to tell you that Chris has been so super helpful to me and really helped me in my journey and kind of making the focus on weightlifting and stuff like that. And I get it. You know, I mean, we have sort of an overpopulation, you know, in the YouTube, you know, I need to have like some foundation or something for my daughter so the sun doesn't shine so much on me on the YouTube broadcast. But what I think that we know that most people don't know, well, like I was saying, that, you know, there's kind of an overpopulation issue where you know, there's too many human beings using all the resources. And you know, at some point, you know, it's been kind of a popular topic in movies lately that we're going to have to kind of get rid of some of the population. I don't think that that anyone would have any problem with internet trolls being like the first, right? I mean, so and I thought of it with you. I mean, like this woman was talking about, oh, I would never want to look that muscular. I mean, when people say that, I really don't think they realize how much hard work goes into doing that, and the amount of exercise, and frankly, a lot of people aren't willing to put in that kind of work, and it's not a disrespect to anyone. I mean, look, we all have jobs. We're trying to just be as healthy as we can, but when you say that to someone, especially another woman to a woman, it just seems wrong. I mean, Catherine has worked with women with eating disorders, good portion of her life. I mean, she's coaching people on a daily basis. I mean, really trying to help folks. And I get it. You're not a Need to Perform member, and you're really not invested in the culture, and maybe you're only seeing something for the first time, and you're reacting to that from a negative perspective. But we really do try to keep it positive, and I need everybody to sort of know that, right? That Eat to Perform is like a family. I mean, it's really, it's like a collection of friends. I mean, when Catherine and I, when we're talking to members and clients, and we're not viewing them as people that we're dictating a set of rules to. We're viewing them as friends that we work out with and that we talk to. Yeah. And so I don't know if Catherine, you said totally, but
I agree that all of the people that we deal with on a daily basis, it's important that I see them as friends. I see them as I want to help them get to where they want to be. Their goals could be completely different than mine, but that's okay, because we're all individuals. And when that woman posted yesterday about not wanting to, women shouldn't have muscle, probably a year or two ago, I might have been angry, but I just felt sorry for her, because she's going through life being negative and being negative. And you have taught us that you don't need to do that.
yeah,
And it is a lot of work.
yeah,
And I think
it is, and
not respecting how much work that individual, wherever they're coming from, I think that's really sad. And yeah, those trolls, man, I could have them all go.
yeah. I mean, like, I think it's hard not to take it personal, because as someone who was 230 pounds, I put up a picture, I mean, like a back picture where my traps are popping out, my lats. I mean, I've got like the V in my back, and like someone made a comment about a small amount of fat on my back, at my lower back. Yeah, I mean, like I literally look like the same thing with Chris, right? I mean, he looks like a character from the movie 300, and I mean, when you come from like morbid obesity to kind of like this next level fit, and someone says something to you on the internet, it's really hard not to take that personal. But you do learn that it's really just best to kind of just ban and delete that individual, and that's our way of sort of filtering the audience, so we're really only talking to positive people. So once again, if you don't know, this is one of our classes that we do, that's a little bit more open, so we can record for you guys to see it later on. But the people that will be asking questions, you guys feel free to go ahead and get anything out there that you want to get out there. Use the chat to do so. Chat's on the right hand side, and then we'll kind of get to that once we kind of cover the topic. But these are our quick start lifetime clients, and when you're an Eat to Perform member, that's kind of one of the things that you can kind of sign up for after the fact. It just depends on the level of service that you need. So the topic today, I think, is going to be somewhat of a boring topic from the standpoint of the way that we're going to cover it, but I think it's also going to be really enlightening for a lot of the people that are going to be watching it for the first time and seeing our content in a way that, the most popular article that we have on our site is how to stay lean while eating carbohydrates, right? And so this is going to be a piece of content for that, or these videos and these podcasts is going to be for that article. And I guess we should start talking about why that article is so popular and why it resonates with so many people, is because most people think that you can't get optimal body composition while eating carbohydrates. It's kind of a common thing. I would say probably 15 years ago, the exact opposite was thought as it relates to fats. And so, we've kind of come full spectrum. And so the question is, why did people start thinking that, and why are they, mostly incorrect? I think what's interesting about Eat to Perform is that we sort of talk to people about moderation in general, right? Like not viewing foods as good or evil, and trying to see what works for you, and kind of, peeling apart the onion to see, how your body performs the best, And if you show me someone that says, well, my body performs the best, on high fat, I mean, one, doesn't really make a whole lot of scientific sense. I mean, in general, your body is going to be more responsive to activity by using glycogen as fuel, and glycogen is a byproduct of carbohydrates. But the genesis of why carbohydrates have been demonized is most people, and I think it's fairly common that most people would go, when I eat carbohydrates, my weight is typically up, and when I don't eat carbohydrates, my weight is typically down. So let's address that topic. When you're looking at protein or fats, the amount of water that is needed to process those is relatively small. And I just want to say we are getting a few questions in. Don't want you guys to feel like we're ignoring you. We're just going to run through this topic and then we'll get to the questions. So fats and proteins don't really require a lot of water to be processed. And, we'll talk a little bit more about why water is important, and why when we're talking about dehydration, keeping carbs low is also another way of being dehydrated that most people don't know. And so that's kind of an interesting part of the discussion as well. So in terms of fats causing inflammation, it's not common. Typically, you will hear people saying that, fats as from grass-fed meat are processed a little bit easier without so much inflammation. In general, there's not a lot of inflammation on both sides, but it might be slightly more. And obviously your body wants to process that. This is obviously a discussion about carbohydrates, but fats are also very important. And one of the reasons why eating an adequate amount of food for what you do becomes paramount is because your vitamin intake, your hormones, all these things are favorable as it relates to fats. And so when you go low carb, low calorie, low fat, whatever it is, you've got to pick one or two. So typically, if you just keep everything low, your body's not going to respond to that really well. And so we've had a number of people that want to try low carb, and then some people that want to try high carb. And in general, kind of like this middle, high carb, low fat, in general, the middle area tends to be a little bit better. And then, as your body responds better to carbohydrate, you can kind of adjust to that. The problem that people run into, though, when they're talking about dieting and eating or counting macros or anything like that, macronutrients basically being carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, like I said, this is a 101 discussion, because a lot of the people that are going to be listening to this, don't normally count calories, aren't necessarily looking for a specific way of thinking things. And we're just trying to get you guys as much information so you can be better informed, right? There's no charge, no cost. If you want to become an Eat to Perform member, awesome. You get to talk to Catherine and I, but in general, we're really about getting you guys information that is helpful, and kind of, takes you to the next level as it relates to your food intelligence. And so when we talk about carbohydrates, basically you're looking at 3 to 4 grams for every gram of carbohydrate. And the reason why that's important is because what carbohydrates are essentially trying to do is they're trying to give your muscle more useful energy. And so I think I mentioned it before. If I didn't, I'll reiterate it, that at rest, typically you're going to be burning fats. At inactivity, typically you're going to be burning carbohydrates. Well, there's other uses for carbohydrates as well. Some people will say, it is kind of funny, because even though that this is a one-on-one discussion, it does bring up a lot of questions. And, one of the questions that often comes up is, is muscle the only thing using glucose? And that's a definite no. Your brain relies on glucose. And so when you are low carbohydrate and you're wondering, or low calorie even, and potentially low carbohydrate as a result, and you start to get like kind of the headache, that's a little bit why, right? And people will often say, well, the body can break down fats and proteins to make glucose through a process called gluconeogenesis. And once again, that's outside of the scope of 101, but just letting you guys know, your body's pretty smart and it can kind of figure things out. And what's interesting about that is that your body's always doing some version of all of these things. And so you're not really like turning a switch off or turning a switch on. You're really kind of just moving things in more of a direction, right? That's kind of the best way to describe it. And so when your body has, it takes 3 grams to 4 grams of water to process. Now, once glucose or glycogen's into the muscle cell, it does not release fairly easily until it's used as energy. So, for instance, the glycogen glucose that's stored in your muscle cells, is basically going to be used as energy, at some point, right? I mean, even, if you look at like a highly glycolytic type thing where you're doing like high intensity work on a spin bike, that'll definitely use a lot of glucose in a very short amount of period of time, and it's a high percentage. But even something like walking, even though it's a low percentage, probably anywhere between 5 to 15%, the longer you walk, the more glucose you're going to be using in that process. And like I said, your organs use glucose, your brain uses glucose. There's a lot of things going on in your body. So having a ready supply of glucose is important. Having an excessive supply of glucose is probably not favorable. But one of the things that's sort of interesting that most people don't know is if you ask people which stores better, carbohydrates or fats, as it relates to stored bodily fat, it would almost seem obvious that would be fat, and it is fat, right? But most people think it's carbohydrates because their weight is up. And so when you start dieting, lower your calories, lower your carbohydrates, what happens? You end up, well, let's just say without the TMI, it leaves one way or the other, right? And everybody knows this, right? And so one, you're kind of dehydrating your body. Your body is mostly water and requires water to function and to do great things. It's not just, it's really, I mean, it's everything from like your skin tone. There's a lot of things that are favorable as it relates to being adequately hydrated. And so when we're talking about being adequately hydrated, really having a discussion about, are you eating enough carbohydrates for that to happen, right? And once again, we're not demonizing fats, we're not demonizing proteins, we're just trying to put the information in front of you guys. So now you go, well, I don't do very much. And I would argue you probably should try to change that a little bit, And one of the things that I've always hated about Eat to Perform is that people go, well, I'm not an athlete, and so therefore I don't know that this works for me. First of all, Eat to Perform is based on the science of total daily energy expenditure. My thing, if you've never heard it and you're probably watching this for the first time, you haven't. Basically, if you're a chain-smoking alien, total daily energy expenditure applies to you, right? So dogs, total daily energy expenditure applies to them. When you look at a wearable, it's essentially trying to calculate your total daily energy expenditure. And so whether you're an athlete or not, athlete is simply another way of saying thriving human being. If you're 65 years old and you have grandkids and you want to keep up with those grandkids, there's some level of athleticism happening there, right? And that's the discussion we're having. We're not saying that, you need to go like, base jumping or rock climbing or anything like that. We're really talking more about having more available energy so you can do athletic things, things that, make you more of a human being. And that's a very simple discussion. We're not really having like an advanced discussion. We're not trying to get you to the Olympics. We certainly have Olympians. We certainly have professional athletes that we work with. But, in general, we're really talking to kind of the regular folks, and we're trying to kind of talk to them about why all these extremes are a negative. And so when you look at why carbohydrates get you better performance in the gym, it's because you have a well-hydrated muscle cell, right, that allows you to do more stuff. And because you can do more stuff, you potentially are asking your body to regenerate new and leaner tissue along the way. And so when you say, I want to lose fat and gain muscle, what you're really saying is that, and when we're specifically referring to carbohydrates here, is I need enough energy to do enough work so I can see a result that shows up in the mirror. Right? If you're using fats, can you do that? Yes, it's possible. There are outliers, situations, there's people that can respond to lower carbohydrates, but in general, most people are going to respond to an adequate amount of carbohydrates for what they do. Once again, I'm going to throw out the qualifier because every single time we start talking about carbohydrates, we get the no carb zealots. We're not saying that you would not have days where your carbs would be lower. if you're resting, as an example, is you wouldn't need a lot of carbohydrates for energy. So that's a good day, to, I mean, do you want to go like 0 carbs or 25 and net carbs? I mean, net carbs, just going to throw this out there just because I think it's something that comes up fairly often. Net carbs is the amount of carbohydrates or usable carbohydrates minus fiber. And that's, if you're looking at something like MyFitnessPal or something like that, they'll often show net carbs and people are like, what's net carbs? So that's what net carbs is. But you go, well, okay, I kind of get it now. My muscles are more hydrated, therefore it's showing up as lean tissue on a body fat test. And if my weight stays stable, then I have less bodily fat on me. Yes, but in the beginning, it may take a while for you to sort of process that, because like initially, for instance, let's say that you had been avoiding carbohydrates or keeping your calories relatively low as it relates to your activity level, you will sometimes have an adjustment period that allow for a little bit of a bounce up where you're rehydrating your muscle. But if you use that new available energy to do bigger and better things, oftentimes that weight will stabilize. When you look at, the scientific data on this in terms of, rehydrating the muscle and the relationship between fats and losing fat, gaining muscle, when most of what we're going to be talking about here is based on the information that we have from clients that are all body fat testing, that are seeing monstrous results really quickly as it relates to the amount of muscle that they have on their frame. And it's not just people that are new to training. That's what's interesting about it, is that we have people that have been training for quite some time, but they've been eating low carb or they've been eating low calories. And then, they do eat to form for 6 weeks to two months. Their weight is either up a little bit or stable, but their body fat percentage goes down a great deal. And I always use the example of a 72-year-old client that we had that put on 6 pounds of muscle. She basically was coming from a deficient background. And if you're coming from a deficient background where you're eating, let's say 1,400 calories, but your body requires, say, 2,100 calories, and you start eating, you gradually move from 1,400 to 21. We don't like take someone and, hey, eat 2,100 calories today, but we gradually move you up. And as we move you there to eating an adequate amount for what you do, if we do it slow enough, what will happen is it will end up rehydrating that muscle. It'll show up as lean mass, and that's not fat. And you can hear my dog barking, super professional podcast. I mean, the thing about these podcasts that's interesting is, I could do them in a soundproof booth in a studio somewhere, and it would just be really super inconvenient to do so. Or we can just do it in my basement, talk to you guys about what we know, bring you the information that our PhDs teach us, and do it in kind of a casual manner. So we choose the casual manner. So, occasionally your dog barks in the background. I mean, one of the best examples that we've ever had, is Kathryn. Kathryn started off, she was already relatively athletic, but like her beginning pictures to now, are just astonishingly different. can you talk a little bit about like your personal scenario and maybe kind of the fears that you had kind of walking into taking a performance way of doing things, and then, you know, maybe talk a little bit about some of your recent struggles with injuries, but then also still remaining, you know, still retaining like body composition.
Well, when I found Eat to Perform, I was at 1,200 calories. That was probably a good day, and less than 20 grams of carbs per day. So I was ketogenic, high fat, moderate protein, and
Just hold on one second, Catherine. I'm gonna be honest with you guys. I had no idea that she was the perfect example, but this is the perfect example of what we're talking about. You know. So, but go ahead, Catherine. I didn't mean to.
No, that's okay. That's okay. And I struggled. I probably spent countless nights reading everything that Eat to Perform brought out, followed everybody, April, Paul, Jimmy on the forum, trying to ask lots of questions. Actually, it was on Facebook at that point in time. And I thought, you know what, this all makes sense. And I am just exhausted. I can't do this anymore. And I bumped up my carbs super fast, too fast, and I had some digestion problems, and I had and I think that's why I can help so many people on the forum, is because I understand what all those bodily functions, what happens in that scenario. And I backed off, and I got things consistent for about 6 to 8 weeks or so, and I started building muscle. Finally, my weight was up about 5 pounds, but I was starting to get people saying, "Hey, you know, what are you doing?" And at that point in time, it was probably about 1,800 calories I had been able to get my calories up to, but I was still feeling somewhat, the body fat wasn't lessening as much. And then April kept on saying, you know what, Kath, for the amount of work that you're doing, you need more carbs. We need to work on that. We need to balance you out, be consistent. And probably about 6 months of being really consistent, I was at 250 grams of carbs. And it was, and I felt amazing. Well, that's when I took those after pictures. And it really showed me how much my fear of carbs was so entrenched that it took me so long to believe that carbs could be helpful, and they weren't the evil thing that we've all been told. And I'm so incredibly grateful. And then this last year, it has been tough. I had some SI joint issues. Now we found out a tear in my left hip, and my training volume's gone down. And after a conversation with Mike Nelson, I said, well, what do I do? My training isn't as it was.
Interrupt just a second. Mike Nelson is one of the PhDs that we have on staff. You know, we have 3 PhDs on staff. We use them as a resource as it relates to research, and so each of them has kind of different area of expertise. But go ahead, Catherine.
Fabulous resources we have. And I said, well, do I drop my calories? Like I'm not quite sure what I should do in this scenario. It's almost easier when you're helping someone else than when you're helping yourself. It's nice to have that feedback from Dr. Mike. And he said, no, you need to keep your body composition, might slide a little bit, but to get better, to repair yourself, you need to keep your calories up. And I'm like, great. And I've kept with that. I haven't gone down super low carb. I've kept everything high, and I'm reaping the rewards now because I'm back. I've been able to squat up to 225 pounds and not re-injure myself. It's been quite the ride. So I'm really looking forward to this next year now that I'm I'm almost healthy, almost 100%, but I'm just trying to train smart and keep my calories in moderation. Does that answer?
Yeah, it definitely does. So, what I will do is I will also add Kathryns pictures, and really the before picture, because, your before pictures, you were carrying a little bit more fat around your waistline, right? And then as you started to add the carbohydrates, your muscles started to fill up and you started to look leaner in the process.
Yes. And the interesting thing is that when I got to a point where I was pretty lean, I was feeling great, but I wasn't recovering very well. I was super sore, and I wasn't quite sure what was going on. And April said, "Kathy, you need more carbs," and I'm like, "Really?" She's like, "Yeah." And one night I had Vitargo. I had no fats and no protein left in my macros. I had Vitargo right before I went to bed, and I woke up. I have a picture, Paul. I should send it to you. My abs were just on fire, and I was like, "Wow, I can have Vitargo and go to sleep, and I wake up leaner. Like carbs are the magic."
Yeah,
It was a cool
I mean,
thing.
the one caveat that I would say is that all of our responses to carbohydrates are different. Now, when I say that, okay, everybody's like, but mine's bad. No, yours isn't bad. Your body holds water differently, and because we all have a different reaction to carbohydrates, you might not load near as well as, say, Kathryn did on that given day. But, Kathryn might not load as well as she did on that day on another day, depending on
Totally.
kind of the amount of activity that she had and things of this nature. But the overriding point that we're really trying to get to you guys is that no food is evil. It can all be used in a way that'll help you get to see your results. And I know that a lot of people, when they think of carbohydrates, they tend to think of things like, candy and ice cream and stuff like this. And those things are fine. And I really would not want to live a life that was so restrictive that I couldn't have things that I enjoyed. So that is a big part of Eat to Perform. But what we're really talking about when Kathryn talks about Vitargo, she's talking about a starch. And Vitargo works similar to potatoes or white rice or things of that nature. And she probably would have gotten a similar response through, white rice or potatoes. But I will say, if you've never tasted Vitargo, it's quite tasty, and they have some new flavors coming out that are going to be pretty cool that I'm excited to taste as well. And so I just wanted everybody to kind of get that information. I think we covered that pretty well. And, in general, I mean, as much as we want to get this information out to you guys, and this was all really helpful for Kathryn and I to figure it out for ourselves. And she's probably a little bit more responsive to carbohydrates than even I am, depending on, and I would say that, she probably is a little bit more active than I am as well. And so you can kind of adjust for that depending on your level of activity. I certainly have my moments though, in terms of activity. And so yeah, we're going to get to questions, but if you're interested in kind of walking through the coaching and things like that, I mean, we have a very liberal return policy, and I think what people see when they get to Eat to Perform is a level of caring, that I think is uncommon. I think in general, most of the other ways of thinking where down, down, down is always the way to go. It's hard to stay positive and upbeat around a bunch of people that are starving all the time. And, at Eat to Perform, obviously we're trying to become better as human beings all the time. And so that's exciting, and people are lifting more weights, and they're running farther, and they're picking up grandkids more, and all the things that make us better human beings. And it's also, it's just, if you're, obviously you guys hear the excitement in my voice and Kathryns' voice. Hopefully that comes off as genuine as I, it is for us. But what I think that, I wish most people could know, I wish they could touch it, is the thousands of people that care so deeply, that are coming from like these restricted backgrounds where, I mean, you can get started at Eat to Perform for $9.95, so, there really is no reason to not try and become part of our community that is really super supportive. And I think it makes a big difference for a lot of people. So I'm going to get to our questions. So far, we only have one. We have kind of a small class, about 10 people. But Sarah's asking, I know in another podcast, one of the coaches mentioned that she doesn't always zero out all of her macros daily. Now, if you're kind of listening to this and you're coming from like the 101 carbohydrates background, this is going to be a little bit more of the advanced side of things, where we can kind of walk people through that have, kind of gone through like the beginning stages, and then now they're, kind of trying to organize things in a more specific way. Because I feel a part of me wants to hit every single macro every single day, but I'm struggling. I struggle to hit my protein. Sometimes I go over my carbs, sometimes over my fat, but mostly I have problems just hitting my macros in general. Any thoughts on where the focus need to be? I should mention I haven't gained or lost weight, been really doing ETP since January. So relatively new. And I've seen Sierra in the forums and making posts and stuff like that. I think that, the person and coach that she mentioned is April, and April is sort of my, I joke that I'm the Robin to her Batman. And I'm fairly certain that's the exact way she thinks of it. But April has been doing the macro thing forever, like her login to MyFitnessPal, her streak is like ridiculously high. And but what she's saying is that, she's not nailing the macros perfectly every single day. What's most important, I would say protein by far, making sure that you're getting an adequate amount of protein, because as we talked about a little bit with this exercise, that's actually kind of an interesting discussion as it relates to carbohydrates, because carbohydrates going to help muscle protein turnover when you're eating an adequate amount of food, because when you're eating, basically protein's breaking down into these amino acids, and when your muscle breaks down, it's breaking down amino acids. So protein's going to provide the building blocks to rebuild that muscle even leaner. And then the carbohydrates will sort of get you to that point. We actually did talk about this a little bit. We glossed over it, and so I'm going to kind of come back to it. But a lot of the times, when we say that fats store easier as fat than carbohydrates, usually the issue isn't so much the fats or carbohydrates in general. It's the fact that calories overall push the calorie number higher, and ultimately that lends, to your fats being stored as fat, right? Because your overall calories are, and once again, it sounds like you can control this in an acute way, and it sort of addresses Sierra's question. Nothing that we're teaching you has to be done perfectly. I mean, one of the things that I always like to say to people is you really can't do Eat to Perform wrong. And, what I'm really saying there is that you can't do any form of eating wrong, but all the other previous ways of thinking told you that rigidity is the secret, right? There is no secret. The secret is hard work and patience and some level of understanding along the way, and trying to figure out what works for you. And, guess what? In a 30-day challenge, you might not find out all of life's problems, and you might find that it's actually more harmful to your mentality and your relationship with food than coming to a full understanding the way that we try to teach people. And so, I think that if Sierra's looking to kind of get to a point where it makes the most sense, really prioritizing that protein, making sure that that's up there. And then I would argue that, eating an adequate amount of calories, is probably the second priority. You could actually argue that that's first, but the problem that you do with that is then all of a sudden, you see somebody who's eating 75% of their calories from Twinkies, right? And so I always try to make sure that the protein is sort of right there. And then we talk about overall calories. And then from that perspective, I would argue that carbohydrates are more favorable for athletic activities than fats are. So your fats can be a little bit lower. I will say that if my fats tend to be too low for too long, I will get like some level of fatigue. I don't sleep as good. It's kind of interesting because, a lot of people focus on the fact that, if you have, once again, I mean, we're always seem to be talking about the stuff that's kind of the exact opposite of what everybody else says. But, when you talk about having carbohydrates later at night, a lot of people say that they not only sleep deep, but they sleep the deepest that, you can sleep. And that is favorable as it relates to rest and recovery. And you end up being, better because of that. And obviously the advice for many years was never eat carbs at night. And there were so many cultures that were showing that just wasn't the case. And that's such an easily debunked thing. Was it favorable for weight loss? Sure. But, one of the best examples that I heard was talking about stress. And when we're talking about eating less, we're talking about exercise, really talking about stress. And what they were talking about was the amount of stress that someone goes through with a death in the family. And they're often, aren't, willing to, eat. They're feeling acute stress, and a lot of times they'll end up losing weight in that process. Kind of that's the same thing that sort of happens when you sort of avoid carbohydrates. One of the big buzzwords right now is the hormone cortisol, and cortisol is sort of your fight or flight hormone, also known as your stress hormone. And people will often talk about when cortisol is too high, you're going to store bodily fat, or you're going to store belly fat. Thing about cortisol, and stress is that there's two things that naturally antagonize those things, and that's carbohydrates and eating an adequate amount for what you do. And so it's sort of funny that so many people in the diet industry are focused on cortisol, but they aren't really focused on telling people the specific solutions to, kind of making that right. And so when you look at weight loss overall, are we really like pulling water out of the muscle? Are we really addressing fat in those scenarios? That's sort of what happens when you avoid carbohydrates, and specifically carbohydrates at night. Some of the topic that we're talking about is you might get weight loss, but it doesn't end up being fat loss, because basically you're just, pulling water out of your body. And everybody knows that about dieting. It's really kind of the hard work is the time after you sort of get that water, but that, getting that water out, when you are looking at a cutting cycle or something like that, it is relatively important. But if you're constantly, well, that's the other thing that really needed, I mean, there's probably a lot of people that have left at this point, that want to get the basic information. But when we talk about inflammation and the inflammation needed to process carbohydrates, or the inflammation needed to process an injury, or, micro tears that happen through exercise, inflammation sort of has a bad rap. And inflammation is what you use to heal yourself. So when Dr. Mike talked to Kathryn about, eating an adequate amount of food as her body was trying to recover, that's what he was saying to her, is that don't compromise your metabolism, don't compromise your recovery ability, because you're scared of inflammation. That inflammation is actually one of the things that's going to allow you to heal. And as long as you can, one of the other things favorable for that is just really to keep moving. I had a really bad motorcycle accident about 10 years ago at this point. And, the first time I did it, I had multiple surgeries. First time I did it, it took me a while to heal. The second surgery was as bad as the first, but at that point I understood the concept of moving. And when I started to move those areas, because, think about, I had my ankle ripped off of my leg, and then, the next surgery was bunion surgery, and they took all the hardware out, and just both scenarios would be horrific, and you would not want to move, but you have to move, because that's what allows your body to process that inflammation and allows you to heal. And moving is a big part of that. And so moving and kind of stretching. I mean, I'm not talking about, going out there and overdoing things. I'm saying gradually, get to a point where you're changing range of motion. And inflammation is a part of that. And, people need to be a little bit more. I think if people started doing the research a little bit more, or at least kind of, one of the things that's kind of cool about Eat to Perform is that once you start putting this information in front of people, it seems like they soak it up like a sponge, But if you're kind of invested in, not knowing, usually there's a reason why, right? Like, I'll just speak for myself, when, fitness wasn't a priority in my life, I kind of didn't want to know, because it would mean that I had to do work, and it would mean that I would have to make some tough calls. And so kind of keep that in mind, that whenever, you don't want to know the number on the scale, or you don't, whatever it is, why don't you want to know?
Yeah.
And usually it's kind of helpful. So Bene's saying, please discuss how to get specifics for carbs, grams, fat grams for the Eat to Perform calculator for fat loss. I have to log off, but we'll listen to recording. Thanks. So this is like the biggest discussion in the coaches course, and it's sort of funny to me, because it's such a small part of things. I think that people want to believe that the calories and this and that, tend to be kind of the way that we do it. There definitely is specifics as it relates to protein. For instance, Mike, in the coach's course, talks about 0.7, 0.8. There are outlier type situations, 0.7, 0.8 being 0.7, 0.8 for your body size. You can go a little bit lower for athletes with a little bit more fat to use, because the fat layer for that individual ends up being kind of a measure of protection for their body. And so, they can still get an adequate amount of protein. And so, when you look at the Eat to Perform calculator, I would say, just as just some general rules, if you're looking for a male, I usually start at a baseline. So, okay, so I'll break it down this way. When you're using the Eat to Perform calculator, you want to use fats. So you want to solve for protein that's roughly 0.7 or 0.8, and you would go to 0.8 or even close to 1 gram per pound when the athlete is a smaller framed athlete. But if it's, 180, 200 pound male, 5'8", then we're looking at 0.7, 0.8. So I hope that kind of helps things. So, in the case of, a 200 pound male, I'm probably going to set the protein at 150 grams just to kind of see what that looks like. Once I set the fats, I'm going to set the fats at about 100 grams, and then I'm going to see the carbohydrates based on their level of activity. When we're setting the numbers for an athlete, a lot of the times if they're new, we're going to go moderately active. And there are rare instances where if the athlete has, more fat to use, we'll even use -10. That's also part of the calculator. And the reason why we do that is because we'd rather default to a little bit lower and then have the athlete saying to me, "Oh my goodness, I'm hungry and I want to eat." And then we'll go, "Okay, what's your weight looking like?" And they're like, "Well, it's down a lot. I'm hungry." And so then we'll gradually kind of bump them up and kind of stabilize things. Remember that the whole point of Eat to Perform is really to kind of establish a baseline for athletes, really kind of push that metabolic math into a favorable position, and then kind of use that, in a rinse and repeat mode to have those athletes see a result. So I would say, my defaults are probably 75 grams for females, 100 grams for males, and unfortunately, I've tried to work with the calculator in the past. Well, we've got a few software updates that are kind of happening right now, and so we may actually be able to revisit this real soon here. A lot of the times for a female, it might actually fall somewhere between 50 and 75 grams for fat. And so, we'll either do that through a spreadsheet that we have, or you can do that by hand. Fats are 9 calories per gram, and then you can make an adjustment as it relates to carbohydrates. But now let's say, I have a 200 pound man, he's 150 grams of protein, and then 150 grams of protein, and then 100 grams of fat, and I'll look at his carbohydrate number, and the carbohydrate number is 625, right? Well, at that point, probably going to raise the protein up a little bit, to where it's, probably in the neighborhood of about 175 grams. And I'll talk to the athlete and see if that's okay, that's doable for them. And more often than not, they'll say yes. And then I'll play with the fat number, maybe bring that fat number up to, let's say 125. You could probably mute yourself too, Kathryn.
I'm just trying to. Thank you.
Yeah. But you can move the athlete to 125, and then that'll bring down, that carbohydrate number to kind of a more reasonable level. Now, here's the other thing too that I think is really important to this discussion. It's that people want to go to the Eat to Perform calculator and they want to start eating that number immediately. And that's not what we teach people, and when you're an Eat to Perform member, this is why in the coaches course, a lot of people are taking the coaches course and they want to figure it all out, and they want to, bring it to their members. And Eat to Perform, like we said, is only $9.95 a month, and you get the resources of 3 PhDs and dietitians and all these coaches that have been trained by these people that allow for a level of support. I mean, when you look at Eat to Perform, I think the reasons why we're successful is because of the excitement level and the level of support. And if you're a coach and you're a gym owner and you can plug into that, like, wow, how amazing is that? But if you're going to sit over there on an island, you know what I mean? And people are just trying to kind of, feel their way through the process alone, and I know the temptation is, you want to kind of do it by yourself. But I'm just saying to people that ends up becoming another version of, well, I'll try this for 30 days and see what works. Well, the problem with trying anything for 30 days, what they're going to do is they're going to ask you a bunch of questions. You're either going to know the answer or you're not going to know the answer. And you're really not going to help them get to where they need to be as it relates to like the full picture, And so what we try to do with the coaches course is we try to have an avenue where coaches can sort of plug into, the overall system. But in general, the temptation is for people to want to use that information, and they certainly can try. But I would bet, I would venture to say that those people are not doing Eat to Perform, because Eat to Perform really is the system where you have the whole community for support. And so if you're kind of off on an island on your own, I mean, yeah, like, as an example, when I was first working out and doing high intensity workouts, I would tell people that I was doing CrossFit, right? And then I took the CrossFit certifications course, ironically, before I actually joined a CrossFit gym. And then I started doing CrossFit. And as it turns out, I really wasn't doing CrossFit. I was, doing high intensity work, which, having your athletes eating more food is good, right? Having your athletes having more support, more excitement, and plugged into kind of the bigger picture, that to me is Eat to Perform, And if that sounds like I'm saying that, every single one of your clients needs to become a member of Eat to Perform to have some level of success, that's absolutely not true. We have 1.5 million followers. Of those 1.5 million followers, I think we have 125,000 people that have signed up for a membership. I have people every single day that come to me and say, I do Eat to Perform, and then I'll ask them if they're a member or not, and they say no, but I've had some of the best results I've ever had in my life. Great. Awesome for you, right? Like, so I'm not saying that every single person out there always needs to join Eat to Perform. But let's be honest, some people have more acute issues, and they need that community. They need the meal planning. They need the training and programming group. They need all the connections. Like when we talk about what long-term in-game success looks like, it really isn't the calculator. It really isn't, And I think that if you can use the guidelines that we're talking about here. There's a video on the calculator page, where we talk about it and we give some basic guidelines. Our coaches, when, we used to actually tell people, like when Kathryn first started, we would have told her to just go to the calculator, and we gave her instructions, and we got to a point where we just started doing it for them. But I can tell you that it's not like this amazingly complex system. I mean, we have basically 3 people that do it. And, in general, what they try and do is they get people the information. And then once people have the information, they're sort of instructed to kind of make adjustments as they're kind of walking through the process. And what we try to do is kind of make sure that everybody understands that, it changes, right? The way that you view it changes. The way that your body responds to it changes. And so you have to kind of test things. So when Catherine talked a little bit earlier about, talking to April, and April said, you got to keep pushing it, and Catherine did push it, and ultimately got better results as a way of doing that. I just wonder if a lot of people are going to get there by having their coach at their gym without the level of support, without the level of excitement, without the free nanos, without the the kill cliff, without the eat to perform opens, without the eat to perform summer camp. You know what I mean? Like, all those things sound fun, and it makes eat to perform very exciting and really cool to be a part of. And if you can replicate that in your gym, let me know. We'll franchise that, and then you can make a good amount of money, because I've not seen a gym that's been able to replicate it the way that we've been able to replicate it online. And we're certainly trying to do that. We're trying to introduce, to gym owners, that excitement needs to be a big part of things. But the problem that you run into, and oh, by the way, after week 5, we do kind of walk people through, like, we have a whole class on it where we walk people through, the different considerations that you would have as it relates to setting macros. So, I think people want to believe that setting macros is like this big honking deal that's going to make all the difference in the world. And I remember that, like, from poker, when I was a poker player, thinking that the math and the odds and the statistics was the biggest part of the deal. And, if you ask me a percentage on the macros, a percentage on the math in poker, I'd say it's about, 15 to 20% of the overall picture, that really kind of the habits, the excitement, really kind of being part of something much bigger. That's a big part of the deal. I think the other thing too, that when we start talking about math, especially, she's talking about fat loss macros, and she puts a exclamation point, I appreciate the fact that you have a exclamation point on your fat loss, but the problem with that is that if you put fat loss first on the list, and fat loss is the absolute biggest thing, are we not addressing fat loss as the calories are going up, right? Are we not addressing fat loss as we're increasing the metabolic math? Are we not, bringing more tissue to the table and less, fat as it relates to, if they're able to stay weight stable? Yes, we are, right? But, if you just want cut calories, I mean, you can go to any calculator on the internet and it will do those for you. But how's that working for everybody? Because it doesn't seem to be working for anybody. Everybody's trying that approach. And I think the temptation is to want to, just constantly be in these cut cycles and constantly get to where you want to go. I mean, Catherine, how long have you been doing Eat to Perform?
I think it's been about 3.5 years.
And in that time, cutting cycles, overall weeks?
I did 1 PFFL, so that's 8 weeks, and I think that's been it. my after pictures, I wasn't cutting.
Yeah, so 8 weeks. Yeah, it's funny, like in the movie, what was it? Jake Gyllenhaal, for the movie Southpaw, they asked him how his abs got so defined for the movie, and he's like, I ate a lot of Chipotle. But he's like, they asked him, well, what diet were you on? He was like, I wasn't on a diet. You don't get abs like that on a diet, and that's the kind of thing that's just like lost on, the regular folks, and for you to have the physique that you have and the performance gains that you have, and be cutting for 8 weeks out of 3.5 years, that's a big story, folks. I mean, that's a really big part of the story that everybody needs to hear. And, no doubt, Kathryn was already relatively lean when she came to Eat to Perform. And so there are people with a little bit more fats to use that ultimately have a little different journey than Kathryn's. But at the end of the day, what we're really talking about is always going to be some level of patience, some level of up the majority of the time, where normalization is a big part of the priority, and then occasionally going down, which we certainly cover in depth in the coaches course. I think that in the coaches course right now, it's week 2. And everybody's like, I want the secrets. It's like, well, it's a 10-week course for a reason.
Patience.
Yeah. So I appreciate everybody being here, and we'll kind of end it right there. Kathryn, I appreciate you stepping in for Chris, and we'll get back to fat loss talk on Thursdays. I don't know if you know this, but the fat loss chat that we put up from last Thursday, that's been one of the best received
Awesome
podcasts so far. So cool. I appreciate everybody being here, and we will talk to you guys later. Bye.
Thank you.